And I just sat there and I looked at him. I was so quiet. He was so quiet. One time in his life, he's quiet.
One of the things I love about the Dominion War, and something Star Trek writers have rarely explored before or since, is how deeply it examined Starfleet and the Federation when faced with true adversity. The war forced people to change. We saw officers die. We saw them maimed. We saw them abandon their principles. Yet I haven't really seen a comprehensive look at the full impact of the war on its victims. So in correcting that, I'll say, let's just get into it. The Siege of AR-558 was one of the most brutal and ultimately pointless battles of the Dominion War. After the Federation secured the Chintaka system at great cost, they discovered a Dominion communications array on AR-558, a place they didn't even name. If Starfleet could break its encryption, they would gain access to the Dominion communications, at least for that sector. It was an invaluable strategic prize, but there was a problem. The Federation alliance was stretched thin, and the resources were scarce. Engineers couldn't crack the relay immediately, and Starfleet, desperate to reinforce other battlefronts, redirected personnel and supplies elsewhere.
One thing's for sure, they're determined to get it back.
We can't let that happen.
I know our orders, Captain, but maybe Starfleet Command isn't aware of our situation. We've been holding this place for 5 months. That's 5 months of fighting off repeated Jem'Hadar attempts to get it back. When we landed here, there were 150 of us. We're down to 43.
I appreciate what you've gone through, and I will make sure that Starfleet understands your situation. But from what I hear, our forces are spread pretty thin in this system.
Meanwhile, Dominion forces continued their relentless assault, wearing down the Starfleet garrison. The soldiers on AR-558 became shell-shocked. They were trapped, abandoned, and barely holding the line. The psychological toll was obvious when supply reinforcements finally arrived, only for the defenders to nearly open fire on them. But paranoia and exhaustion weren't the only things they suffered.
McGreevy put this bandage on me. He ripped up his own uniform to make it. He sounds like a good friend. He was a jerk. I couldn't stand the guy. He wouldn't shut up. Yap. He thought he was the world's greatest authority on everything. I know. He's dead. And I should have more respect. But God, I hated him. One minute he's tying this bandage around my arm, talking his head off. And the next minute he's lying flat on his back with a hole in his chest. And I just sat there and I looked at him. I was so quiet. He was so quiet. One time in his life, he's quiet.
There's something about watching someone die, killed by another, that fundamentally breaks a person, even if it isn't immediately obvious. Vargas was one such victim. He had been stationed on AR-558 for 5 months, long past his 90-day rotation. In that time, he watched his friends die. He watched people he barely knew die. He watched people he didn't like die. And through grief, loss, and sheer survival, those people became the most important part of his life. The war changed him, wore him down, and left him hollow. But watching others die wasn't the only horror these soldiers endured. Winning a battle demands sacrifice, and that sacrifice isn't always a glorious one. Lieutenant Junior Grade Nog was ordered to locate the Dominion encampment. He succeeded, but on the way back, his team was ambushed. The ranking officer was killed, and Nog lost his leg. His injury didn't just change his life, it affected those closest to him.
We've got to get Nog to a hospital.
We will as soon as we can.
That's not good enough.
I'm sorry.
Sorry? If you really cared about Nog, you would never have sent him out on that patrol.
Now you listen to me, Quark, because I'm only going to say this one time. I care about Nog and every soldier under my command, understood? Every single one.
Sisko had to live with the weight of the decision that put him in harm's way. And Quark, who always tried to keep his nephew out of Starfleet's violence, was forced to watch Nog struggle in recovery unable to do anything to help. War takes more than just limbs, though. The Dominion War forced Starfleet to abandon ideals it once held sacred. Sisko, one of the Federation's finest captains, authorized the use of subspace mines to cut off Dominion reinforcements. Was it the practical decision? Absolutely. But a few years earlier, Starfleet officers would have scoffed at such tactics. Now, this was considered restrained. And it wasn't just Starfleet officers who lost themselves. When a Jem'Hadar soldier threatened Nog, Quark grabbed a phaser and shot him. In that moment, he was no different from the humans he had spent years judging for their violent instincts. By the time Starfleet finally relieved the garrison on AR-558, 74% of the defenders were dead. The remaining forces weren't even soldiers, most were engineers, barely trained for frontline combat. And in the end, it was all for nothing. Within a year, the Dominion retook Chintaka. The communication array so many had suffered and died to protect was never successfully broken. For the survivors, the war wasn't just about battles fought. It was about what they lost, physically, mentally, and morally. The question that lingered long after the war ended was simple. Was it worth it?
I love you. I love you, Zial. No. Come.
Before I go too deep into this, let me be absolutely clear. Dukat was evil, by every definition of the word. Was he a character you could sympathize with? Arguably, yes. But that doesn't change the fact that he was responsible for countless atrocities. Now that we've established that, so I can reference it when people inevitably try to call me a Nazi, let's talk about Zial's death and what it did to him.
No! You heard her. She was a traitor.
There is no question that Dukat was a victim of the war, even though he was one of the primary reasons it happened. At his peak, he was one of the most powerful figures in the Alpha and Beta Quadrant. But when the Dominion lost control of Deep Space Nine, that power was ripped away. He couldn't process it. He couldn't believe he could lose. But it wasn't just about losing the war. He lost his daughter. Dukat endured something that no father, fictional or otherwise, should have to go through. He watched his most loyal officer, Damar, execute Zial. He stood there helpless as she died in his arms, and that broke him. The once proud leader of Cardassia, the master manipulator, the man who had clawed his way to the top, was reduced to a whimpering, shattered shell. He sat in his cell, rocking back and forth, speaking to people who weren't there, clutching to delusions because reality was too much to bear. For the first time, Gul Dukat had no control. His breakdown wasn't just emotional, it was psychological. Dukat's mind fractured, and in DS9's Waltz, we see this firsthand. His conversation with Sisko on the ship all but shows that he had lost everything.
You and Major Kira took care of her for almost a year. I wanted to thank you for that. It was very generous.
Zial was a very special young woman. It was a pleasure to have her with us, even if it was only a short time.
A short time is all she ever had.
And then, once he was stranded on a barren planet with Sisko, Dukat begins to hallucinate. At first, it's subtle. He claims he can hear his former officers talking about him. But as time goes on, the hallucinations take full control. Imaginary Weyoun praises him.
200 lives for 200 lives. That's justice, not malevolence. Justice.
The Dominion would have never been so generous.
Imaginary Damar urges him to keep fighting, justifies what he did.
It was a noble, if misguided, vision.
Imaginary Kira condemns him, calling him a monster.
How did the Bajorans react to all this? On my 1-month anniversary, they blew up an orbital dry dock, killing over 200 Cardassian soldiers and workers.
We didn't want a reconciliation. We wanted to destroy you.
What makes this terrifying is that these voices aren't just random figments of his imagination, they are projections of his inner conflict. Weyun's voice is his ego, the part of him that still believes he's a great leader, destined for victory. Damar's voice is his past, the part of him that still clings to his military strength. Kira's voice is his guilt, the part of him that knows, deep down, he was the villain all along. At first, he simply argues with them, trying to justify his actions, but as the episode progresses, he stops resisting. He fully embraces the lie he's been telling himself. I was right. The Bajorans were the problem. They should have been exterminated.
I knew it! I've always known it! I should have killed every last one of them. I should have turned their planet into a graveyard the likes of which the galaxy had never seen!
This is the moment Dukat completely loses his humanity. The delusions stop being a conflict and start being a comfort. He accepts them. And when Sisko finally hears Dukat basically say, I should have killed them all, it becomes clear. Dukat has finally descended into madness. And none of this would have happened if the war never existed.
I couldn't live with myself if you hated me. Come, we'll talk on the way home.
Home?
Cardassia, we have to leave here, Ziel, before the Federation arrives.
I'm not leaving.
These people are our enemies.
They're not my enemies.
Zial, the daughter he lost, was also a victim of the war, a child who was forced to make impossible choices. She had been raised in exile, never fully accepted by either side of her heritage. She committed what Cardassians would consider treason, choosing morality over loyalty, rejecting the empire her father had built his life around. And just when she and Dukat finally reconciled, when she finally believed she had a family, she was murdered, horrifically. Her death didn't just destroy Dukat, it impacted everyone around her. Garrick, who genuinely cared for her, and Sisko, who recognized the tragic weight of her loss. But for Dukat, Zial's death was the moment he lost everything. His power, his daughter, and ultimately, his sense of self. After this, Dukat's mind began to twist. He started to rewrite his own history, to justify actions, to convince himself that he was still the hero of his own narrative. And in a way, from a strictly Cardassian perspective, maybe he wasn't entirely wrong. Cardassian culture rewarded strength, pragmatism, and authoritarianism. He was a gentle authoritarian, which is saying something because he killed 5 million people. But by their standards, he wasn't a villain. But none of that mattered, because no matter how he rationalized it, no matter what he told himself, Dukat was shattered. He was a man consumed by his own actions, his own ego, and his own failures. He had started a war, killed countless people, and thought himself untouchable. And yet in the end, the one person he loved more than anything was taken from him. There were millions, if not billions, of Bajorans and Federation citizens who would never feel sympathy for Dukat. To them, this was justice. To them, he deserved everything he got. But that doesn't change the fact that Dukat was completely, utterly obliterated that day. 2 people died in Sacrifice of Angels. One was Zial. The other, Dukat himself. It's just that unlike his daughter, his body kept moving. A walking corpse, doomed to chase after power he would never truly have again. There are countless victims of the Dominion War. Some lost their lives, others lost their morals, their ethics, their very sense of self. And we've only scratched the surface. If you want the full breakdown, you'll need to be a channel member. Click the join button below. New exclusive videos diving deeper into this will be up within the week, and you won't want to miss them. But now I want to hear from you. Who did I miss? Who do you think suffered the most? And more importantly, was the Dominion War worth it? Or was there another way out? Let's keep the conversation going. And of course, like, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next War Reloaded.